Hello and welcome to our last webinar of the spring, a study group on the potential of dynamic bilingualism and translanguaging in bilingual education. I will be your host today. My name is Sarah Hesson, and you'll be hearing from Professor Ofelia García today. After a very brief overview, Dr. Garcia is going to talk about students and teachers in bilingual classrooms with translanguaging. There's going to be about 20 to 25 minutes for questions and answers, so as the presentation goes on, please feel free to send your questions in, and then when it's time for questions and answers, we'll pull those up and we'll be able to answer a lot of those questions for you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Ofelia García, who works here at CUNY Graduate Center. Hi, Ofelia.
Hello, Sarah. I'm delighted to welcome all of you back. This is a follow-up to the first webinar, as you know. Today, I had promised you that we were going to start really looking at what teachers do in bilingual classrooms, especially in biliteracy instruction. And I've divided the presentation into two sections. In the first one, we're going to be looking at what students think as far as translanguaging is concerned. And then I want to go over two biliteracy units and look at what teachers do. I want to start with a very brief review because I know that some of you are joining us for the very first time, and others have heard this before, and you have been busy reading chapters and books. So I want to remind you that we considered language as languaging in action, as the social and cognitive interaction with others, and that we consider bilingualism not just simply as additive bilingualism with two languages that are equally balanced, but as dynamic bilingualism, the idea that what speakers do is really adjust and adapt their language resources, their language repertoire to the social circumstances in which they have to communicate. You know, I don't have to give you examples. All of you are bilingual teachers. You've heard this many, many times, but here are two very simple examples to make sure we all understand each other. So this is an emergent bilingual student who is a kindergartner, and one day looks up and he says, "Está lloviendo mucho," because it is raining. But he right away realizes that lots of people at his table, at his snack table, do not really understand him. And he says, "Look, it's washing. There's washing afuera." So this is an example of how this child, of course, is using all his language resources in order to communicate in this situation. And I'm sure that all of you have heard examples such as this next one from a bilingual class that Martinez reports on. Zulema saying, "Page what?" And Carolyn saying, "Wait, this one? ¿Cómo está?" Y Zulema, "Sí, pero ¿qué page?" Carolyn, "A ver, ¿qué page?" 21. You have tons of examples like that. So something that we discussed last time when we were focusing on these theoretical aspects of translanguaging was that for bilingual programs, and especially dual language bilingual education programs, we need to have spaces for each of the two languages, yes, but we have to have spaces with flexibility, spaces that really make sure that we have a context in which children can really communicate, and also where all their language repertoire is acknowledged. Many of the children in bilingual classrooms are speakers of more than two languages, and many of them have very different language practices from those that are represented in the classroom. And then, of course, we need to have a translanguaging space, a space in which both languages are used flexibly, creatively, critically, etc. The first part of the presentation focuses on what students think when using translanguaging, and the examples that I bring you today are from a Japanese case. This is a writing class for Japanese students. It happens to be an English writing class, and this is a work of Naomi Kano that can be found in both her dissertation and work that she and I have written together. And this is an English class where, of course, the product is to write an English essay, but the process that Naomi uses leverages translanguaging. So what does she do? She makes sure that in order to write, of course, students have to have the appropriate information. So she provides them with text, parallel texts, both in English and Japanese, that really provide them with information. And some of those are translations of the same text. Some of those are not the same text, but they are parallel texts, some in English and some in Japanese, on the same topic. Then the discussion that ensues in class, of course, takes place in English or Japanese, and many times both. The pre-writing in the class is done in Japanese or in English, but of course the writing is progressively all in English, because we have to remember that there's a difference between the product and the process. So the product is all in English. This is an English writing class, but the process that she uses incorporates translanguaging, enabling the students to really use all their language repertoire in order to make sense of the task at hand. So these are some of the reflections of these students as they engage in translanguaging in order to write in English. So Satomi, for example, when she reads for information using the text in English and Japanese, says, "In English, I was reading corresponding passages in the Japanese language whenever I didn't understand it in English." So in other words, Satomi, of course, is using the text in Japanese in order to read in English. These are emergent bilingual students. And Haruka, who is thinking of how to come up with vocabulary words in English, says, "I was thinking in Japanese at the time. I could think of synonyms in English because Japanese words kept shooting through my mind one after another. So I depended on my Japanese. For example, we had Usopp among the list. When I understood the word in Japanese, an English word, consume, came through my mind. This way, I used the Japanese language for the task." So another example then of how this translanguaging really enabled the student to come up with English vocabulary in order to write. And this is an example of of a child who is already bilingual, who is researching for information, and of course Naomi has allowed them to use both English and Japanese texts to prepare the English text. And he says, when I was doing research on the pros and cons about cell phones, they were writing an essay about cell phones, I used materials both in Japanese and English. I searched for the articles in Japanese on whether cell phones were beneficial, and I took some of them. Then I did the same thing in English. I ended up using the materials in both languages. I searched in both languages in order to get the best ones available. I think that this is an example, of course, of a child who really understands how to use his entire language repertoire in order to write a good essay in one language. And he knows, of course, that he can access both languages in order to get the best information possible. So the second part then of my presentation, where I'm going to make sure that we focus today, is what does a translanguaging space in a bilingual classroom look like? What do teachers do? And I bring you today examples of something that this particular fourth grade dual language bilingual teacher in New Mexico, Carla, calls a Cuéntame Something space. It's a translanguaging space for biliteracy. And this is part of a forthcoming book with Susana Ibarra Johnson and Kate Seltzer on translanguaging classrooms. And I bring you two units. One is a reading of Three Wise Guys by Sandra Cisneros, which is, of course, a story in English with some translanguaging to Spanish, and then a reading of the Santero's Miracle by Rodolfo Anaya. That is a bilingual text. I start with the first text. So this is Three Wise Guys, Un Cuento de Navidad by Sandra Cisneros, and what I want to go through is the 10 moves that this teacher makes with translanguaging. So first, of course, she reads. There's a shared reading of the bilingual text, and I'm just going to read the first part. The big box came marked "Do not open till Christmas," but the mama said, "Not until the day of the Three Kings, not until Dia de los Reyes, the 6th of January. Do you hear?" That is what the mama said exactly, only she said it all in Spanish. And then the story goes on. So, of course, then the second move in this classroom is that there is a whole discussion of what El Dia de los Reyes means. And during this discussion, of course, there is no prescribed language to be used, because after all, the text that the teacher is reading is also a text that leverages translanguaging, that uses translanguaging. So the teacher doesn't say this discussion has to happen either in English or in Spanish, but she allows them to use both languages. The third move that she makes is to ask them to construct a text in the other language. So one of the things that she does is she copies from the text what the mother said in English in the left column. And then students collaboratively come up with what the mother would have said in Spanish. And then one child writes it in the right column, and then students read the Spanish. Again, working with their entire language repertoire in a literacy lesson, not just Spanish or English. Then there are guided reading groups, and during the guided reading groups, the teacher asks the group to really pay careful attention to the words that Sandra Cisneros has chosen to include in Spanish. These were some of the words, chicharras, urracas, comadre, and so the students pay attention to why it is that these words have been chosen, of course, in Spanish when this is an English text. And there's a lot of talk about the sounds of these words, chicharras, urracas, and why an author would have really chosen the Spanish words and what it reflects to use those words instead of just words in English. There is then translation, what is always called resemiorization, a transformation, a redesign in the other language. And so students rewrite a paragraph from the story so that the Spanish-speaking mother would understand. Now, it's important to understand that in this story, there's a Spanish-speaking mother who is actually speaking in English in the story because it's an English story. So one of the things that the teacher does is make sure that the students understand that they now have the power to give voice to that Spanish-speaking mother and encourage them to really rewrite that paragraph using Spanish. A sixth step that she takes is she makes them aware of multilingual differences. And there's a whole reflection and discussion on the different characters in the story and how they use language. There's a Spanish-speaking mother. There are bilingual children. Ruben and Rosalinda in the story are bilingual. And there's a father then who speaks English but can't read it. So there is a discussion then of the differences in language use in families, and in Latino families especially. And of course the children are relating all of this to their own language practices at home. And this is something that rarely happens in schools, when we never question that the language of the text do not reflect our own language practices at home. So this enables the teacher to really make the students aware of the different language practices at home. Then, of course, there is now a bilingual resemiorization. That is, in groups, the students then rewrite the story for the bilingual family and a bilingual audience. That is, after being aware of the fact that that families use many languages, etc., then they are aware of the fact that there is a bilingual audience out there that needs to be told the story in both languages. So how do you then rewrite that story that is mostly written in English with some Spanish words for the bilingual mother, or for a Spanish-speaking mother, or for a bilingual family where some of the family members do not speak English and some of the family members do not speak Spanish? Of course, another move that she makes is making them very culturally aware. There is a long discussion about all their diverse cultural practices at home, starting, of course, with El Día de los Reyes, but then continuing to all kinds of practices. And this discussion, again, takes place sometimes in English and sometimes in Spanish, because there is no time-determined space for either of those two languages. Remember, this is what the teacher calls a cuéntame something space, right? So it's a translanguaging space that she has constructed. The ninth step is to make sure that the community has been integrated, los abuelitos y las abuelitas. So the teacher invites the abuelitos and the abuelitas to tell their stories of their own cultural practices. Again, when this happens, some of the abuelitos tell the stories in English and some of them tell them in Spanish. These stories are just not told, but they're collected. And the idea, of course, of the teacher is that there will be then this finally redesigned, this final resemiorization through a reader theater. So the groups take the abuelitos or the abuelitas cuentos to create this reader's theater text to then perform it in the local community theater. Again, taking into account the fact that the audience will be composed, some will be monolingual English speakers, some will be monolingual Spanish speakers, and some of them will be bilinguals. So how do you then construct a story to make sure that not only do the students use their entire language repertoire, but that also includes the many very different voices of the entire community, their entire language repertoire. So this is one example of a cuéntame something space that this teacher has constructed. Here's a second example. This one is from a bilingual story. It's a bilingual story, a bilingual book titled The Santero's Miracle, written by New Mexican author Rodolfo Anaya, with illustrations and a Spanish translation. Now, Anaya wrote, of course, a story in English and has some translanguaging in the English text. But then the book was translated into Spanish, and the texts appear in English and Spanish in the same page, sometimes side by side, sometimes top to bottom, sometimes one page and then the opposite page in the other language, but both languages appear in the text. Now, this is the same teacher. This is also a fourth grade teacher, Carla, and she now makes 10 moves with translanguaging, and let me just go over what she does. She starts, of course, with a bilingual read aloud, but she doesn't just read the paragraphs, the whole story in English, or then the whole story in Spanish. What she does is she reads some paragraphs in English, other paragraphs in Spanish, and does this in a very natural kind of way so that the children are constantly coming in and out of the story, sometimes in English and sometimes in Spanish. And by the way, even though we sometimes are suspect of this practice, what we know from the recent neurolinguistic studies is that it's precisely this capacity of bilinguals to shift languages, to go from one language to the other sometimes, that creates some cognitive advantages. So this is a practice that not only has literacy consequences, but also has cognitive consequences. Of course, then there's a discussion of the reading, and again, as we saw before, the students participate in the discussion without regard to the language in which she read. So sometimes she's reading paragraphs in English, and the children are responding in Spanish because she has not dictated what language to respond in. The idea, of course, is to deepen the discussion, to have an engaging discussion and not just a superficial discussion. Then there's a lot of group reflection and discussion on the choice of lexicon from Spanish in the English original text. What is amazing about this lesson is that the students themselves were able to develop categories for those choices. And this, of course, develops metalinguistic awareness. For example, they were able to understand that when that Spanish was used in the English text for informal greetings and interactions. For example, they say buenos días, vamos, gracias, entre, ¿qué pasa? And terms of relationship and endearment, abuelo, hijito, compadre, mijo, mujer, amor, and of course food, and of course other cultural practices. So this again creates a metalinguistic awareness in the children about when languages are used and why, which does not occur unless the children are really engaged in this discussion. A fourth move, of course, is this opportunity for word study that happens when both languages come together. One child asks, is mijo even a word? And one child, of course, says, well, it's a word in Oaxaca. And one says, well, it means mi hijo, but I can't find it in the dictionary, of course, because they were looking for hijo without the H, which is a way in which the book writes hijo. And of course, the teacher has projected the text on the whiteboard. But then one child immediately says, I saw hijito with an H in the text. So this, of course, means that there's a huge discussion about the silent H in Spanish versus the English H. Again, children making connections between their entire language repertoire and the way that languages work. And then, of course, one child asks, because they always ask, why hito and hijito? Because they've been talking about hijo, and all of a sudden there's hijito, so why hijito? And then one says, well, I'm called Ricardito, and the other one says, well, I call my grandmother Abuelita. And this, of course, leads a teacher to have a whole discussion of diminutives and what they mean and what is the morphology for them in Spanish, ito, ita, and what it means in English. This, of course, means that they now, the teacher engages them in this, again, redesign of the text, resemiorization of the text, through asking them to focus on morphological changes. So she asks them to change some of the text into the diminutives. So one sentence that became very problematic was, Don Jacobo se bajó de la cama, se vistió y fue a la ventana para ver el pueblo entero. So, of course, they started out with Don Jacobo se bajó de la camita, se vistió y fue a la ventanita para ver el pueblito entero. And of course, this again made absolutely no sense for one child who said, well, my pueblito is not small, and pueblito doesn't always mean small. It just means that I love it. So this again created a whole discussion about the ito, ita, and whether it was always a diminutive or what it meant, whether it was also affectionate. So these children are really becoming very aware of language through this translanguaging in biliteracy. Another move that she makes, of course, is a whole discussion about the importance of translation. You notice that there's a books translator, and the children notice that there's a books translator. And so the teacher tells them that translators get paid a lot, and they do a whole research about book translators and how much they get paid. And of course, this is alongside a whole discussion about the fact that they are always translating for their families. They go to the doctor and they translate, they go to the teacher and they translate, and they don't get paid. So there's a whole discussion about what a gift it is for them to be translators, and yet the fact that they're being exploited when others are getting paid. Then the teacher always not only emphasizes how difficult it is for authors to write, but also what a gift it is, again, to have bilingualism as an expression in writing. For example, when she reads, Don Jacobo and his grandson worked all day on the wood carving of San Isidro and spent a lot of time selecting and mixing the colors to get the right shade. The teacher read, all day they worked at painting the carving. And the teacher says, authors have to do the same thing with their words. And then, of course, one student exclaimed, yes, but as bilinguals, we can paint with more colors. We have to use all our colors. So again, this consciousness that they get, these students get, that as bilinguals, they have these special colors that they can use and maximize. Another move is her connections with family stories. The students were asked to share the story of San Isidro with families and then ask about their farming practices and the legends of San Isidro. And they came back with all kinds of things, including the fact that what was in the book was not what their parents and families sang, that San Isidro, Labrador, quita el agua y pon el sol was not included. So there was a lot of talk about what was there and what wasn't there. And then they write a group research report in which they put together the findings from their family stories and conduct research on the internet using websites in English and Spanish. Some of the groups are asked to write in Spanish and others are asked to write in English, but they're always asked to quote directly from the text that they had gathered. And students are free to use words from other languages in their writing for literary effect, as Anaya did. And finally, of course, they put together a bilingual PowerPoint presentation of the findings for the bilingual families and audience. So, a translanguaging classroom enables students from the very beginning to offer opinions on issues raised by text, regardless of the language of the text, question the texts, discuss the relationships among ideas in bilingual texts, evaluate different language features in the bilingual text and explain their meanings, compare and contrast language features and discourse structures in bilingual texts, and extend published texts with those produced by community members. And I think that these are advantages. So now, Sarah, I think that there are questions from the audience on translanguaging. So I have from Sarah a whole bunch of questions. We can start anywhere. So I'll read the first one. It says, what suggestions do you have for creating a translanguaging space similar to the Cuéntame Something space in my bilingual kindergarten class, where most of the students speak English at home? Well, I think that translanguaging is really, really important for, especially for children also who are learning Spanish, in this case, a bilingual kindergarten. So stories that use mostly English, but some Spanish, so that it can be repeated and they can listen to it and repeat it and think and, work with it. I think that is extremely important. So the fact that I focused on writing in today doesn't mean that the oral text cannot be worked with. And so I think that there is a space for it, and that you need to really cultivate. There's another question. It says, in number 8, you mentioned cultural awareness. How can we as educators go beyond food festivals and holidays to create meaningful experiences for students? And this question is from Becky. Well, Becky, that's a great question. And I think precisely that's what we're saying, that that there has to be much more than just food and holidays, that there has to be real practices. Cultural practices are not just what we do that is different, but what we do that is the same as everyone else, and that are often encoded in the way in which we speak and the way in which we use language. So I think precisely translanguaging in a classroom enables the culture to come in, the cultural practices to come in, because through language, meaningful cultural practices, because through language you're bringing in the culture instead of just having to appeal to food, etc., which you're absolutely right, should not be the case. And that's why, again, we're having a space in which this is happening all the time. Another question from Maria is, how do you evaluate culturally relevant books to be sure they are not stereotypical? I think that we all want to work with texts that are not stereotypical. I think that a lot of the literature that is produced, unfortunately, may be stereotypical, but some of it reflects cultural practices that often are not reflected in English-only texts. So I think you're right. We have to be careful that we just not always read texts that are specifically about cultural practices that are different. And I think that's a problem. But, we also have to work with publishers. And the publishers often publish things that are more stereotypical because they're the ones that are really explicit out there. So I think that one way of making sure that this just doesn't happen is to make sure that the stories come from the students' families themselves, rather than from material that has been published and someone has paid for. And I think that would ensure a much more authentic experience, and that's why I think that both of these examples, both of these teachers, or actually both of these units included the family members coming into a classroom, family members who can then take it further. Raul says, I notice that if I give my students a choice, they mostly speak English. Should I be concerned? Is there something I can do so they choose Spanish more often? Raul, that's a great question. And that is why today I focus on the translanguaging space. But if you remember my first slide or one of my first slides where I had those two spaces, one for English and one for Spanish or for any other language, with some people that were flexible. Remember those? They had little coils. They were flexible. I think that's important. It's important to have a space for English and a space for Spanish because after all, or for the other language, because after all, we know that only by giving affordances to people to try out language, right? To use language, especially if language is an action. That's how we started. We started out by saying that languaging is action, is cognitive and social action. So if you don't give children opportunities, affordances to really use that language, then they will never be able to really develop in that language. Having said that, bilingual children especially also need to have opportunities to use their entire language repertoire. Why? Because there is a creativity that comes around by using both languages, and there's a criticality about bilingual communities that comes about by using both languages. So I am not saying to give up the spaces. I'm saying to use the spaces with flexibility. That is, you have to, if you're going to include the entire language repertoire of all your children, you're going to have to be flexible at times. But you want to encourage opportunities to use either English or Spanish or Chinese or Korean or Haitian Creole or any other language. But besides that, I think teachers also have to create a translanguaging space in which bilingual children create texts and use texts that show their own language practices, not just those of monolingual English speakers or French speakers or Spanish speakers, etc. And bilingual children do not have enough opportunities to see themselves represented in text. And that's why it's important to have that space. But I agree with you that you have to provide opportunities, and that's the art of teaching, in which the children would be encouraged to use either English or Spanish at times. I have another question from Julie. How much translanguaging should be used in a dual language bilingual classroom? I notice I always call them DLBE, Dual Language Bilingual Education. So how much translanguaging should be used? I think you're the teacher, and I think teachers need to have a design. Translanguaging is not random. It cannot be random. It has to be strategic. It has to be part of your design, right? So I would again say that there has to be a space for one language and a space for the other, with attention to the fact that children's language use, or people's language use, is never quite the same as the language used in classrooms. So you have to be flexible with the way in which you use language within those spaces. And then you have to be able to construct a translanguaging space. How much? Again, I think that is a question that does not have an answer. I think you have to come up with what makes sense for your students strategically. And every school is different, and every classroom is different, and the children in your classroom are different. And there cannot be a formula. And I know that we love formulas because it makes it easy. It makes it easy to say 80% of this and 20% of that. But I'd rather that you construct the two spaces, right, in a dual language. You're talking about a dual language bilingual classroom. You construct the two spaces, that you build in flexibility, that you design the two spaces as two spaces, right? And then that you also design a translanguaging space that you may be able to design slowly. In some cases, in some schools, I see that teachers say, well, I'm going to do it once a week. I am going to, once a week, I'm going to bring the two languages together. I'm going to do that so that there could be some meta-linguistic comparison because it's important. I mean, otherwise, when are these students going to put this together? I mean, it's like learning about bilingual education and learning about special education and then having a bilingual special education child. You have to bring that together, and it takes a lot of effort to bring it together, and you can make it work for them. So I would say you have to be your own judge of that. Melissa asks, how can I bring other languages, such as indigenous languages, that my students speak into my Spanish-English dual language class? Melissa, I think that's a great question. I think that anybody who teaches in New York State today knows that in a dual language bilingual class, there are just not speakers of English and speakers of the other language. That the supposedly English speakers are speakers of Haitian Creole, of Arabic, of Urdu, of Bengali, of everything, and and of Spanish too. And the supposedly Spanish speakers on the Spanish side are also speakers of Mixteco, of Quechua, etc. Because, of course, there's a much more heterogeneous setting in New York City, especially today, than ever. So you have to bring them in. You know, we always talk at CUNY-NYSIEB of the idea that you have to create a multilingual ecology in your school. We always say there are only two non-negotiables for us. One, that you have to use bilingualism as a resource, and because we believe that bilingualism has to be a resource both in English-only classrooms as well as dual language bilingual classrooms, we also insist that there has to be flexibility within the spaces. But secondly, you have to build a multilingual ecology in your classrooms and in your schools. A dual language bilingual classroom that only cares for English and the other standardized language, major language, dominant language, such as Spanish, which, you know, we might think of it as a minoritized language in the United States, but certainly it's a dominant imperial language. So you have to be aware of the fact that there are going to be children with other languages in your classroom, and you're absolutely right. This multilingual awareness, and I think a translanguaging space especially gives room, space for the indigenous languages to come forth, because what you're doing is you're making sure that you are honoring everyone's language practices. Lee says, do you have suggestions for teaching grammar and spelling in each language by using translanguaging? Well, you know, one of the things that we always say is that if language is action, right? It's social action, it's cognitive action. We really want them acting on language first, right? But of course, language also has form, so the forms come along. But I think if you heard me during the first webinar, one of the things that I'm very sure about is that there is general language ability, and then there are specific ability to use certain forms, right? So we all know people that may speak English perfectly, but then, or Chinese perfectly, or Spanish perfectly, but they can't make an argument. They can't hold an argument. They can't express complex ideas. Now, that is general language ability. And I think one of the things that the Common Core state standards do is actually give us some leeway, because, for example, if you're going to find text-based evidence, let's say, you don't have to, and you're a newcomer from China, you don't have to do it with an English text, and you don't have to do it in English, but you have to be able to do it in Chinese, because as Jim Cummins told us a long, long time ago, there is, well, he calls it transference, but we're talking about the same kinds of strategies that are used, because again, there's one language landscape, one language repertoire. So I would say that one of the things that the translanguaging space offers is precisely to be able to compare forms in both languages. And I think that there is explicit forms, and I do think that there is room in in bilingual education, certainly for explicit teaching. I think one of the advantages of bilingual education is precisely that the language is not taught explicitly, but that the language comes as a result of teaching content so that it's authentic, it's innovative. But we also know from years of work in immersion programs in Canada that that the Anglophone children who went through immersion programs in Canada always fell behind in speaking and writing because they had not had explicit also instruction in form. So what I think is important is to make sure that we pay a lot of attention to the use of language, right? That we pay a lot of attention to the children's using language interactively, making meaning interactively, engaging in text. And then to make sure that then the forms that correspond to those uses come along. You can't do it the other way. But certainly a translanguaging space, one of the big benefits of a translanguaging space is precisely that it makes that instruction explicit so that you can compare forms in the two languages. David asks, could you speak to your own personal experiences with translanguaging? Did you find it useful throughout your own education? David, I mean, I'm rarely asked about my own personal life, but I'll tell you, I was born in Cuba. I came to New York at the age of 11. I lived in a Latino neighborhood. I translanguaged my whole life. Because, as you know, that's what bilinguals do. One of the important things for all of us to remember is that translanguaging is actually the discourse norm in all bilingual communities, right? I always say we can't have dinner at home without translanguaging because someone doesn't speak English, someone doesn't speak Spanish. So if you want to include everyone, it's like the classroom. You have to be able to translanguage once in a while. So I think translanguaging enables making meaning. It also develops the ability to be able to suppress certain features of your language repertoire at certain times. I mean, one of the reasons why the two spaces are still important and we're not giving them up is because children have to be taught both to get features from their entire language repertoire, but to suppress, unfortunately, certain features in certain communicative situations. For example, right now, I'm speaking in English. Now, it's not that I don't have Spanish somewhere, because I do have one language repertoire that has features from English and one language repertoire that have features from Spanish. I'm suppressing some of those features to make sure that you all understand me. I think that translanguaging is the fluid language practices which enable communication in bilingual communities and among bilingual people. And it also includes being able to suppress certain of those features to make sure that we can communicate at certain communicative moments. So right now I have to suppress my Spanish in order to make sure that that English is developed. One thing that we know from Bialystok's work, for example, the psycholinguists and neurolinguists, is that the cognitive advantages that come from bilingualism come not only from this ability to shift back and forth, but also the ability, the idea that we have to suppress certain features. And it's precisely this idea of suppression of features that gives us cognitive advantages, because we're constantly working, our executive function of our brain is working a lot harder when you only have to use one language. Lucia, of course, writes, is this the last question?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the last question. Lucia writes, how can I explain the use of translanguaging in my classroom to a supervisor that expects language separation? That's a hard one, Lucia. I'm sorry that I don't have too much to tell you, except I think you have to remind her that, first of all, this is what happens naturally. I mean, I didn't come up with translanguaging off the top of my head, not even theoretically. I came up with it because I observed classroom after classroom after classroom that told me that they were doing English in the morning and Chinese in the afternoon, and I went in and there was a lot more going on because, of course, children were engaging with information, engaging with text, and therefore there's a lot more going on. I think that you can ask her, her or him, your supervisor, to read some. We have on our website some information about translanguaging. I think that the literature on translanguaging is growing. I think if she believes in bilingual education, she must have read Jim Cummins at some point. Jim Cummins doesn't talk about translanguaging, but he talks about bilingual strategies. And he talks about the idea of the two solitudes and how harmful it's been in immersion programs in Canada. So, we have lost opportunities to leverage our society's multilingualism, and I think that's all we're trying to do. So, language separation is important because of the affordances, but again, language separation with some flexibility so that we can engage the whole child. And I think what's important to tell your supervisor is that bilingual education is not for the language. Bilingual education is for the children. And if you put children first, I think then you know that at sometimes a separation of languages means submersing the child in a language that he or she does not understand. And I don't think any educator that cares for children wants to engage them in learning through a language that they just don't understand. And I think that if she cares for the children, she would see that. We have wonderful resources on our website, www.CUNY-NYSIEB, which stands for New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilingual. We are generously funded by New York State.org. And so you will find under the publication tab free resources that you can download, you can print, you can distribute, and I think they're very, very good. They're being used all over the world, and I think New York State should really make use of them. One is a translanguaging guide, which is the guide of strategies, and then we just recently published a curriculum guide. It's modeled after the Engaged New York, and I think you would find it helpful. For those of you interested in English-Spanish bilingual education and interest in biliteracy, we just put out a guide to translanguaging in Latino literature, authored by Vanessa Perez Rosario. It's got a whole range of authors and books and stories and how to teach them, and it's got wonderful links. And then we also have a publication of the 11 languages of New York State. We are broadcasting this to all through New York State. One of the 10 most famous languages or most numerous languages in New York State is Karen, the language of Myanmar, Burma, and no one knows what to do with it. And Alex Funk in this guide tells us what to do with it. So I would encourage you to download our resources. So just to wrap up then, I think that what we want to do is to make sure that we know what the actions are and what the strategies are for translanguaging. If you are attentive to meaning making, then of course you have to use translanguaging when it's appropriate for understanding, and you have to encourage the students translanguaging to project their own voices. You have to use classroom resources for translanguaging. You have to have them. You cannot do it without the resources. So you have to have available, and you have to produce multilingual and multimodal texts, including fiction, informational text, and reference resources. You have to make sure that there is available technological enhanced media, including iPads and computers. iPads are wonderful for bilingual study, especially because you don't need a dictionary anymore. So I would encourage you all to buy iPads for your classrooms. And you have to make sure that there is a multilingual, multimodal classroom landscape that includes listening and visual centers and text, technologically enhanced media, multilingual word walls, multilingual sentence starters, and cognate walls. And again, for those of you who asked about indigenous languages and languages other than the two of bilingual classrooms, this is very, very important to have that landscape really be multilingual, not just bilingual. A third thing is to make sure that you design a curriculum and classroom structures for translanguaging. You have to have peer grouping according to home language to enable this collaborative dialogue to take place. You have to make sure that there's project and task-based learning to build on multimedia and kinetics. You have to make sure that there are research tasks that the students can do. And with those research tasks, you don't have to tell them what language to research in. That is absurd when there is a web today where information is available in English and Chinese and Russian and all the other languages that we need. So to find new information, to become real researchers, you don't need to do it in English only. You have to have curriculum thematic units because thematic units means that you can integrate ways of languaging and producing knowledge. And you have to make sure that you also design language inquiry tasks. This again relates to the question that I was asked about whether translanguaging can help with the development of forms of language. Because these language inquiry tasks are important for cross-linguistic comparisons, for cognitive identification, to build translanguaging capacities, and extend meta-linguistic awareness. And thank you so much for listening. And I now turn it over to Sarah Hesson to say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Garcia, for once again sharing just so much insight with us and giving us all a lot to think about. So what's next? You're going to receive instructions with a follow-up email on how to receive a $50 stipend for a task that will be related to the webinar that you just saw, as well as the earlier, the first study group with Dr. Garcia that took place in March. This webinar will also be archived on our webpage, so check back at CUNY-NYSIEB.org to see the webinar or to share it with others who may have missed it. And finally, I would just like to give you a thank you, and please feel free to email us. We're going to be continuing with webinars next fall, so if you have any suggestions for what you would like to see, I would encourage you to send us an email and share your ideas with us. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again in the fall.